Hey everybody, Marshall here to share some really cool news with you. I trust at this point you've all heard about Kvik yeast. This is that Norwegian ale strain that can ferment cleanly at temperatures as high as, no joke, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 38 degrees Celsius. Absolutely crazy stuff. Well, last year, Imperial Yeast dropped A43 Loki, their Kvik strain, as a seasonal release, which meant we all had a pretty small window to get our hands on some. Not anymore. Imperial Yeast recently announced they're making A43 Loki a year-round strain due to popular demand. They're excited about it. I'm super excited about it. I've had some amazing beers fermented with Loki at terrifyingly warm temperatures. It is amazing stuff. Go grab some A43 Loki and see what all the fuss is about for yourself. Brewing is rooted in centuries of tradition, and I think it's safe to say most of the methods that we use to make beer today were originally developed by those who came before us. Now, while some brewers have come to question the purported necessity of some of these previously established brewing rules, many continue to view certain age-old practices as having a positive impact on beer, particularly when it comes to making lagers. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this episode, contributor Cade Job is with me to revisit a topic we addressed way back in our very first episode.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to talk about Kettle Trub today, but at the risk of maybe repeating ourselves a little bit, but hopefully not too much, we're going to focus on your experiment, Marshall, that you did, part 3 of the Great Kettle Trub experiment.
Right, yeah, that's right. This was the very first episode that we ever did for the Brewlosophy Podcast was on Kettle Trub, and the reason for that is because it was the very first experiment that I ever did back when I was just kind of messing around with this whole Brewlosophy thing. I think it's an interesting one. Kettle Trub, was one of those things that I'd always kind of wondered about, and I certainly made an effort to kind of reduce it when I was racking over to my firm vessels in the beginning. Since those experiments and the one that we're going to talk about today, I've sort of developed some thoughts that I'm looking forward to chatting with you about, Cade, and we'll also be discussing the results, like you said, of a more recent experiment looking at how fermenting with Kettle Trub affects a pale lager. All right, just a quick reminder that hop harvest is coming up quickly, and we'd love to meet up if you'll be in the Yakima area when we are there. Jake, Brian, and I are going to be hanging out with our friends from Yakima Valley Hops from September 20th to 23rd. So if you're around, please reach out on social media or email, and we will set something up. On Saturday, September 28th, 2019, contributor Matt Delfiaco is going to be attending the Southeastern Homebrew Minicon, which is also known as the North Carolina Homebrew Fest in Raleigh, North Carolina. This event is put on by our sponsors, Atlantic Brew Supply. And from what Matt told me about last year, it's a really great time. Tickets are available now for just $10 at atlanticbrewsupply.com. I'm going to be speaking at the 2019 BrewCon in Dublin, Ireland in just a few weeks on October 5th. If you're in the area and able to make it out, you'll be treated to sessions by the great Ron Pattinson of Shut Up About Barclay Perkins. It's a rad blog. Philip Woodnut of Wicklow Hop Company, and yours truly. In fact, the experiment beer is brewed, and I'm looking forward to getting some data from our Irish friends. Tickets for BrewCon can be bought at eventbrite.com, and you can learn more about the event at nationalhomebrew.ie. Finally, my friend Seth Klon from Mecca Great Estate Malt asked if I might let our listeners know about what sounds like it's going to be a really rad event that he's putting on. It's also happening on September 28th, and it's called Brewing Man. This event's going to be held at Mecca Great Estate Malt. I believe it's at their farm in Madras, Oregon. There's going to be lectures, demos, and of course, great beer. Unfortunately, none of us from Brewlosophy are going to be able to make it, but we love Mecca Grade. Seth's a badass dude, and if you can make it, if you're around the area September 28th, you should consider heading out to Madras for the Brewing Man event. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you're into this thing that we're doing here over at Brewlosophy.com or the Brewlosophy Podcast, and you want to make sure that we're able to keep on doing it, please consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small pledge, you'll receive rad rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for September is somebody I'm really excited about. I've been excited about all of our guests, but this one is it's kind of interesting because he's an actual professor. He's a researcher of hops. His name is Dr. Tom Shellhammer. I'm sure all of you hop nerds out there have heard of him. From Oregon State University's hop breeding program. He studied topics such as hop creep, as well as what we call the dry hop saturation point. Cade, you did an experiment on that one.
Yeah, for sure. I hope he doesn't rip me too hard on that. I think we did pretty good, though. Confirmed his results at least.
Yeah, at the very least. He actually contacted me. It's how we got in contact after you published those results, and was really pleased that we were experimenting with this stuff. So it's going to be a really good one. Past guests have included folks like Michael Tonsmeyer, John Palmer, Gordon Strong, and many, many others. And all past sessions are available on our private Facebook page. So you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brulosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and a review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate it. I know people might think that it doesn't matter, but those ratings actually do. Not only do they help us because we get to read what you guys think, but they help people find the show as well. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers beautiful stainless equipment like the turnkey BH15 Pilot brewing system, which has a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Hardware also has a ton of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and homebrewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brulosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Okay, listener Eric Brumbaugh, I think I'm saying that right, had some feedback on our recent short and shoddy Vienna Lager episode. He says, you made a comment that the malt from Mecca Grade seemed to impart a vanilla character to the beer. While I've never brewed with Mecca Grade malt, I have brewed with L17 Harvest twice. I love that yeast, but as soon as you were describing the flavor, it hit home that it was the same taste I get when I use that yeast. You couldn't have described it more perfectly. The two beers were a Baltic Porter and an Imperial New Zealand Pilsner. He puts that in quotes because I don't think that's a real style. While it could be the malt, I really find it interesting that it is the exact same thing I experienced, but thought was a flavor from the yeast. With you using L17 more often than me, is it something you consistently notice, or just in the Vienna Lager? First off, I could have been more clear and explained that the subtle vanilla note I got in the Vienna Lager is similar to what I get in most of the beers that I make using Mecca Grade Venora malt. That's their Vienna style malt. I've made very similar beers using that same malt with different yeast strains, and they all have that kind of consistent, very, very subtle, I don't even know if vanilla is the right word, but it's kind of a creamy, sweet thing that's really pleasant. I've also used Imperial L17 Harvest numerous times with non-Mecca Grade malts, and I've never noticed a vanilla flavor. But I guess now I'll be paying much closer attention. Cade, you've used L17 a few times. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I love L17, and I don't know that I would say necessarily a vanilla in flavor, but maybe, that is one thing that I really like about Harvest, and especially I've got a Märzen fermenting right now that I'm really excited about.
Nice.
But it does add just a little bit, right? It adds a little bit of that sort of, Harvest is a great name for it. It's a little bit, I don't know if it's vanilla-y, but it's that same kind of vanillin that you would get from an oak age, but very subtle. We're not talking about like an oak age flavor, but it's there. And that's what I get from it. And that's one of the things I love from it. To me, that's a really, really good character in most German lagers. I mean, I even had a Pils last night from St. Arnold's, and it's got a little bit of that same character too.
Interesting. I'm definitely going to be paying much closer attention at this point, because in my mind, it was always from the Mecca Grade Estate malt, which I hear from a lot of people. There's this really nice, to me, it's just high quality, flavor, I guess. It's not a bad thing, but when I use Mecca Grade Estate malts, it just has that consistent kind of character to it. Something I've never noticed in L17, which when I was talking about it in the last episode, or of the Vienna Lager episode, one of the comments I made is that L17 just seems to have a beery character to it.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly
what I get. I don't know how else to describe it. It reminds me of when I would walk by my stepdad when I was 7 or 8 years old, and he'd just crack open a Budweiser. That smell, that beery smell is what I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it could be a Venora malt too. I mean, it very possibly could be a malt and the yeast, and maybe both of those things combined together is just beery goodness.
Yeah, and there's going to be people out there, Eric, just so you know, who when you say that you're getting a buttery, or I'm sorry, I slipped, a vanilla flavor from fermenting a high OG Baltic Porter or an Imperial New Zealand Pilsner, they're probably going to guess that it may actually be something like diacetyl. So you might want to do a diacetyl test. One of the easiest ways to do that is just take a sample of the beer, cover your glass, like a taster glass, with some foil, and then throw that in some warm water and let it kind of warm up, and then poke your nose down underneath that foil and see if you get any buttery badness, if you will. Thank you so much for the feedback, Eric. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brulosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Now, I've never really been a big fan of smoked beers. I can barely stomach ones that are made with all smoked malt. And while I can appreciate a wood-aged beer, I don't necessarily seek them out. Well, listener Matt Fitzgerald sent me an interesting beer he brewed, which he says, this is what he says about it. It's called a Mesquite Sticka Alt Beer. Now, my understanding is a Sticka Alt Beer is just basically a strong version of like an alt beer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, strong version of an alt beer.
So he says, I remember a podcast a bit ago. You were talking about wanting to try something that I had on tap at the time. I can't remember exactly what the correlation was, but it had something to do with the mesquite honey, if I remember correctly. So I found a couple bottles from this alt beer that I used mesquite smoked honey in. Standard straight ahead alt beer, then added 12 ounces of mesquite honey at flame out and another 12 ounces at about 80% attenuation, which then fermented all out again with a FG of 1007. Whoo boy. It's pretty cool, and there's no wood in contact of this beer. Only mesquite honey, which he says he got at Trader Joe's, which gives it a nice, slight woody character that worked great on the malty alt beer base. I also dug how it dried it out so much. It's not sweet, but you can still get a hint of honey flavor.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
What do we got here, bro?
I don't know. It's pretty.
Ooh, it tastes like oak.
You didn't taste it.
Rich mahogany. It smells like rich mahogany.
That doesn't smell like
You know the taste of wood.
Would I?
All right, let's take a little sip of this rich mahogany. I have many leather-bound books.
It smells like a barley.
We are learned men. Some men run from a challenge. Learned men run towards a challenge.
Oh,
I like it a lot.
rich mahogany.
It's delicious.
It is good.
It is some kind of an amber something. It is a Ethethon or no, it's not that.
If you say so.
If you say so. It's a Thethon if you say so. It's some kind of a fucking who knows. It's delicious. I like it.
It is good.
It's some kind of a who knows. If whoever made this delicious beer is looking to name it, you should call it some kind of a who knows. Oh, that's incredible. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, I would definitely drink this.
You know why? Well,
tell me why.
Well, because we're too just
morons.
Exactly. If someone's serving this to like the broader brewing community, they're going to have all these comments. But for you and me, it just tastes delicious.
It tastes good. Yeah.
It tastes delicious. And it doesn't try to do too much. And those are the beers that you and I like.
I'm telling you. Nice and clear.
I'm going to give it 1,000 jerseys.
So with mine, we're going to give it a total of 3,500.
3,500 Jersey Tims. I think we broke a record there.
That's a pretty high score. That's amazing. I don't think. I've never seen 1,000 Jersey Tims before.
I don't even know what 1,000 Jersey Tims looks like. I think it's kind of this fluid rating system that they've got. But this is the beer. I got to be honest with you. I don't really like smoked beers. I'm not a humongous fan of wood beers. But something about this mesquite. Mesquite honey beer. It was absolutely delicious. Definitely not as smoky as a smoked beer or as woody as a wood-aged beer, but it had components of both that were just subtle enough to be really, really pleasant. I don't know how long Matt had this sitting around for. I don't know if the age maybe did something to it, but I'm telling you, it's something. If you're the type of brewer who likes to add stuff to their beer, mesquite honey from Trader Joe's is a good bet for a Sticka Alt. It's really, really tasty.
I love that mesquite flavor in my beers. I really do. We have a lot of mesquite here in Texas, and so we barbecue with mesquite a lot. I love the flavor that it adds, and it's just so funny how these guys have improved their palates. Rich mahogany and mesquite. I mean, yeah, come on. I mean, he nailed it. Just, got the wrong wood, but nailed it. I mean, that's the exact flavor. I mean, they're so similar.
Yeah, I little disclaimer. When we do these reviews, they actually sit at the mics for about 3 to 5 minutes. And I cut them down to about a minute because otherwise they'd be really boring. At one point, I was in the back talking to our buddy Justin, aka Patton Oswald, and Jersey had to turn around and tell me to shut up because I was distracting him from his beer review. So they're taking this thing seriously, which is kind of fun to see. For those who've been listening to the show for a while, you may recall that Matt Fitzgerald is the person who also sent in a Bud Light clone called Jan Light that he brewed for his mom, and the guys really loved. I really loved. He's just a fantastic brewer. So Matt, thank you for the beer. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. All right, we'll be back after these messages from our sponsors. So I've been hanging out with brewers and craft beer nerds for a long time now, and while we do occasionally have our differences, one thing it seems we all share is a love of learning and trying new things, as well as saving a couple of bucks. Well, right now, Craft Beer and Brewing is helping fans of Brewlosophy learn more while saving some coin by offering 20% off the price of a subscription to their awesome magazine. Chock full of brewing insights, tips, and recipes from industry experts, Craft Beer and Brewing is seriously great. I read every issue page to page myself. To get 20% off your subscription, all you have to do is sign up at beerandbrewing.com/brewlosophy. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today. Want to brew quality craft beer at home? The Grainfather provides a brewing system with superior design, innovative features, and the latest technology, allowing you to brew professional quality craft beer at home. Mash, sparge, boil, and cool all in one unit, meaning there's less equipment to use, clean, and store. No need for burners or hot plates. Just plug it in and brew great beer. Then get the best out of your fermentation with the Grainfather conical fermenters and glycol chiller. Plus, enhance your brewing experience with the brand new free-to-use Grainfather community app. You can take your brewing tools and your recipes with you everywhere, use brewing calculators on the fly, manage your recipes, and monitor your brew session from anywhere. Use your mobile device to manage your Grainfather brew wirelessly, automate mash schedules, and multitask without removing any of the brewing hands-on fun. Grainfather products can all be found at www.grainfather.com. Plus, as a Brewlosophy podcast listener, get 10% off your order. Just use discount code Brewlosophy19 at checkout. That's BRULosophy19 to receive 10% off your order. So head to shop.grainfather.com now to get this great deal. The idea that racking only the clearest wort to the fermentation vessel, leaving behind all the coagulated crud created during the boil, would ultimately lead to a higher quality and clearer beer just seems to make common sense. At least it does to me. And I certainly felt this way prior to my own experimentation. And while my feelings have morphed a little bit over the years, let's spend a little bit of time talking about what exactly Trub is and how it's believed to affect beer, particularly, delicate pale lager.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I mean, we may go, a little bit repetitive from that first episode, but I think it's important to really talk about what Trub is in this one, because the experiment that we're going to focus on today was actually letting the beer age on Trub, a lager on Trub.
Right.
So, Kettle Trub is... When I'm referring to Kettle Trub, and I think what you were testing in this experiment, Marshall, is we're talking about all of that gunky, gooey, coagulated protein, hop material, hot break, all of that stuff that whenever you're looking into the beer looks like Chinese egg drop soup. It's right. all that gooey stuff that's in the bottom of the vessel. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there. It's mostly hop material and proteins, but anything else that's in the beer, if there's anything that was left over from the malt, or any minerals that carried over from the mash, it's all of those things, and it's all in there, and it creates this sludge at the bottom of the kettle.
Yeah, and it does. The people refer to that egg drop soup appearance as the hot break. As you're heating up the wort, those proteins coagulate and they form clumps. And depending on what I've found, at least depending on the pH of your wort, those clumps can either be big or small. But those clumps ultimately get heavy enough, they flocculate, and then they get heavy enough to drop out. And at the end of your boil, they will, if you just leave your wort alone for a little bit, they will create a nice thick, sediment on the bottom of your kettle. And I think traditionally it's believed that it's best to leave that crud behind for various reasons. There's one of the reasons that, and I'll be honest, when I did the very first Kettle Trub experiment, one of the big things for me was, clear wort means clear beer. And so my thinking was, I don't know if it has an impact on flavor. I don't, all that stuff was in the wort anyways, maybe it doesn't, but I just want the clearest beer possible. So in my head, leaving it behind was mostly for clear beer, but there are some claims that it actually impacts the flavor, aroma, and other characteristics of beer.
Yeah, I mean, I like that comment about clear beer because I think that's how sort of every brewer sort of starts. I mean, I don't want to speak for every brewer. I know it was at least you and I share that in common. That's what I was thinking. Like, oh, we've got all this mess in here. Why am I going to put this in the fermenter? I want this beautiful, clean beer. I don't want esters. I don't want off flavors or any of that stuff. Why am I going to just add all this gunk in there? And then, you read the traditional brewing texts, especially the homebrew texts that we're all starting with, Palmer's How to Brew, Papazian's Complete Guide to Homebrewing, and a bunch of others, and they all talk about whirlpool. They all talk about whirlpooling after the boil, create a dense cone of stuff, and then rack the clear beer off of that.
Right.
And what a lot of people didn't know is there's some studies that have been done that suggest that long contact with Trub could lead to off flavors and actual other than just clarity impacts, but actual flavor and aroma differences. And some those studies say that it may be directly proportional to the amount of time that it's left on the Trub. So your first two experiments that you did on this, I think you pulled those off pretty quickly.
Yeah, they were typical ale fermentations that I fermented for what I don't have those in front of me now, but I think it was between 8 and 10 days or so, and then they were racked to kegs. So they did not sit on the yeast cake or the Trub cake in the fermenter for very long.
Yeah, exactly. And so the point of this one, the experiment that we're talking about today was, well, what happens if we let it sit for a while? And we'll go into the experiment details a little bit later, but what's the concern that people are actually trying to find out about? So, I mean, obviously, again, not a scientist, but doing a little bit of research online to try to figure out, well, what's the purpose of this? Everybody says we should whirlpool and pull off this clear beer, but why? If I don't really care about clarity, what else could affect it? Well, it turns out there's a bunch of stuff in there. I mean, those hop, we've done a lot of research to suggest that hop material, especially in the fermenter after fermentation, can oxidize and can lead to oxidative flavors and staling of beer. There's also long chain unsaturated fatty acids, which are those proteins as they're coagulating together. Well, I guess they're technically. I'm not sure. I don't want to go. I don't want to go over my skis here on this. I'm not sure if proteins and fatty acids are the same, but I do know that there are a lot of fatty acids in Trub.
Right.
And those things can pair and oxidize and create really nasty off flavors like goaty flavors,
right?
Barnyard, and even those can combine with oxygen and stale your beer as you move on.
That's actually the biggest argument that I learned of after I did the first Trub experiment was people kind of coming back to me and saying things like, hey, the lipids in Trub are the real issue. And if the beer is fresh enough, those lipids don't have enough time. They oxidize. Now, again, this is what people told me. I'm not like you. I'm not a scientist. I don't want to go over my skis either. But what they were saying was those lipids oxidize a little bit slower and take a little bit longer to actually impact the flavor of the beer, but it is the oxidation of those lipids that people are most concerned about when it comes to racking a wort to a fermenter.
Yeah, and I mean, on the flip side, there's also a lot of benefits that people have found. There's some studies even that said, those fatty acids are actually really useful in the fermentation process. I mean, they're a nutrient that yeast needs to complete and fully attenuate, not produce esters and those other things. So it's really interesting to me. We're sort of doing a balancing act
right.
a little bit. It seems like how much Trub should we have in there? Is it based on time? Your first couple of experiments showed that just a massive amount. I think the second one was a massive amount of Trub versus as little as you could get. Virtually none.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that one came back non-significant, as there was no difference in the taste of the beers. So you've got sort of this, two experiments that show, hey, maybe just the presence of Trub doesn't necessarily create an off flavor of beer, but what about if we did it over time?
Yeah. What if we let the beer sit on that Trub longer, ostensibly allowing time for oxidation or whatever else to happen, right? I mean, another thing one could argue, I mean, back in the old days, if you were making a lager, you fermented it and then you racked it over to a conditioning tank or a secondary, right, fermentation vessel, and you allowed it to lager in that secondary fermentation vessel because you wanted to get it off of the Trub cake. Perhaps there are reasons for that as well, other than just oxidation of lipids or whatever else the Trub might be carrying with it.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we're always looking at what the commercial guys are doing at a homebrew level and trying to emulate the best that we can to make consistently good beer. And all the homebrew guys are doing, all the commercial level guys are doing a whirlpool step. They're actually, spinning or, jetting the wort back through there and doing a long whirlpool hop stand and rather than racking clear wort into the fermenters.
Right.
So you've always got this, you're looking as a home brewer going, well, the commercial guys are doing it, and there's some studies that says that we should do this. Maybe I should do this too.
Totally.
Now, a quick caveat on that too. I think I'm not terribly familiar with commercial brewing systems, but it's my understanding that part of the reason why commercial breweries do that is because of the downstream processes. So they're running through a wort chiller, they're running through maybe a mechanical filter and some other things. So if you've got just a massive amount of gunk running through all that stuff, it's going to clog up your system, and for them, time is money. So I think there may be, in addition to an off-flavor component, an actual mechanical process.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing from my pro brewing friends. But also, I mean, I think if you just take a tiny little step back and look at it, if you are brewing for a living and you need to make money doing this thing, you want to reduce every risk possible. We talk about this all the time, and even if it comes out that Trub doesn't seem to have much of a negative impact, and that's hypothetical. I'm not saying it doesn't. That doesn't have much of an impact. You still want to do everything you can to reduce the risk, even if that risk is minuscule. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even in my own brewing process, you know, I mean, I was telling, I think we've talked before. I check my pH whenever I do my mash. We've done a bunch of experience that suggests that may not necessarily be something that you have to do at a homebrew level.
Yeah.
But it's something that I do because I want a consistent product, and I know if my pH is in this certain range and I've followed all the other things that I'm used to doing on my brew day, I'm going to have a decent beer.
That's right. Yeah. Well, let's spend a minute kind of breaking down what some of the claims are in terms of specific impacts that Trub can have. First and foremost, we talked about, clear wort means clear beer. One of the more fascinating findings from our past high Trub experiments that we've done, that I've done, is the fact that the high Trub beers in these comparisons almost always, in fact, in the two that I've done, and we'll talk about the third one in a bit, the beers have come out crystal clear compared to hazier versions of the non-Trub beers. That to me, I still don't understand the exact reasoning why, but it would appear that one benefit, quote unquote benefit, is that racking some Trub over to the fermenter will lead to likely a clearer product.
Yeah, I mean, the photos from those first two experiments are pretty, you can tell a pretty significant difference just in the pictures. And I mean, I've seen it myself too, I mean, if you're not paying attention to Trub or something like that, especially some of those first beers that I brewed, there's this deal with chill haze. We talk about it all the time, chill haze versus permanent haze. And chill haze is largely a reflection of proteins that are in the finished beer that bind with other particles and come into suspension, as the beer chills, and then when it gets up to room temperature, those proteins fall out and the beer clarifies. So, this also sort of leads and ties back into, well, it kind of makes sense that some people would find that there's some other particle in there that's causing this chill haze, and it does have a flavor impact or an aroma impact.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned, I like the term goaty. To me, that is like, when you go to the petting zoo, that kind of smell. I'm not sure that's what I get, or I don't know if that's what I would get from a beer necessarily that doesn't have Brett in it. But to me, what I've heard, at least, in terms of the aroma and flavor impact of Trub, is that it can, and this is, I had to dig for this because it's really, people don't really discuss this much. They just say, don't rack it over to your fermentation vessel. But digging in, what some people referred to was a wort, like a worty smell for some reason. I don't know if that's or like a really yeasty, kind of a yeasty flavor, not necessarily bready, but kind of that weird if you were to like open up a fresh pack of yeast and you smell it, it's kind of got that weird aroma to it. I've heard that before, but otherwise, I'm not exactly sure based on the literature or what people are telling us out there, what you might expect, a high Trub beer to taste like. I can tell you what my experiences are from the past experiments, but that's a little bit different than what's been said.
Well, sure, yeah, and I mean, I think there's some research out there that suggests, we talked about those unsaturated fatty acids.
Yeah.
There's research out there that has shown that unfatty acids can bind with oxygen and they create, I think it's oleic acid. I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong, just write in with feedback. But I think it's something like that, and that's what creates that sort of goaty smell in the finished beer. So there are studies out there that have shown that these different components can oxidize and lead to aroma flavors in the beer. Now, that said, I, like you, have not tasted goaty in a beer that didn't have Brett in it or some other really serious issue.
Yeah. Well, and I'm gonna go over, before we get into methods for Trub separation. I'll go over my experiences with the past two experiments on Kettle Trub. But one of the other things that you might expect is for a high Trub being fermented with the beer to have some impact on mouthfeel. Things that you might read about in homebrewing forums is a kind of a slick feeling because of all of the particulate that's left over in the beer from from presumably, at least, from fermenting with all of that Trub. Again, that's not something that I've necessarily experienced, but
and for sure, there's also the slickness from that stuff, but also let's not forget too that there's hop material that's in the Trub as well. So who knows what amount of that hop, either character or hop acids that are binding to the actual material that are then released, or are we going to get grassy off flavors or things like that? All these are sort of concerns that I think are legitimate concerns just from visual observation and knowing like what's actually going into the beer. So this one's always been a fascinating one for me.
Yeah.
How much Trub should you put in, or and does it actually have an impact?
Well, when it comes to again, delicate lager beers, particularly those on the paler side, but I think any dedicated lager brewer is going to tell you don't rack any Trub over at all whatsoever. And again, I think it's a legitimate concern. That is tradition in its finest. You just don't do that. One of the other arguments that you'll hear, I think it's an interesting one, has to do with shelf stability. So not just how long that beer lagers on the Trub, but once it's packaged, how long is it going to last? And the argument is that if you ferment with a bunch of Trub, that you are in essence decreasing the time that beer is going to taste good once it's packaged.
Yeah, and this one was fascinating for me. Whenever this is one that I could totally see. You're putting all this gunk and crap in the beer, in the fermenter. I call it crap, sort of, sarcastically, but you're putting all this stuff in the fermenter, and then you're fermenting out, and all that stuff's sitting in there. It sits in there all the way until kegging and packaging. So what's going on? What's going on with the fermentation? Is the beer's just sitting there interacting with this other stuff? What's actually happening? And it makes sense to me. Yeah. You're staling, or you're giving more potential opportunities for things that will negatively impact the flavor and aroma in the beer as it sits.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's again, kind of on a practical level, it just seems to make sense. Now, there are various methods one can go about using to separate Trub from wort as they're racking it over to the fermentation vessel. I think the easiest method is just to, once you're done chilling your wort post boil, you give it some time to settle. If you happen to have a kettle that has a valve on the bottom, one thing that I think works really well and is incredibly easy is just to prop up the front of your kettle a bit, maybe throw a 2x4 underneath and let it settle out to the back of the kettle. And that way, when you're racking off, you're racking the, very, very clear wort. I don't know about you, Cade, back when I used to let wort settle all the way out like that, it'd only take about 10, 15 minutes for it to, all that Trub to kind of settle in the back of the kettle.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it doesn't take long. And you know, I don't want to skip over either too that, you know, there's cold break material that also happens, right? I mean, the whole point of chilling your beer quickly is to get a bunch of those things that are still suspended in the boiled wort to get them to coagulate and fall out. And they do so by lowering the temperature. So that's also a way that I think universally people do to help get that material out too. But yeah, you know, I mean, there's easy ways to do it. Like you said, just tilting the kettle back is probably the way that I first started doing it. And then, you know, you've got whirlpool, which we've talked about, you know, which is depending on what equipment you've got, just, you know, taking a spoon and trying to swirl it around so you get a nice vortex going, and then just let it sit for 10 minutes, 12 minutes. And so all of that stuff will spin together, and then it'll coagulate in this nice little dense cone in the bottom. And then you can rack from the side or from the top or whatever makes sense for your kettle.
Yeah, and if you don't have a valve, I mean, it's even easier because you can start your siphon. If you're using like an auto siphon to rack to your fermentation vessel, you can start your siphon from the top and then slowly, you know, lower that your siphon to keep the clearest wort racking over. Now, there's other thing you can filter. I've seen people. This seems like a weird one to me, but people who like get a really big sieve, or you know, like a and then put cheesecloth in it, or a really fine mesh, you know, brew bag or something like that. And then, but you know, I guess it works. I would imagine you have to clean that out a few times during.
That's really funny that you bring that up, because that just reminded me of a story. I wasn't intending to tell this story, but I think it's hilarious. I think it may have been the third batch of beer that I ever brewed. Somebody had said, "Oh, hey, yeah, you should strain all this out." So I really just literally went and got one of those. I guess a strainer. It's got like the handle on it, like a black handle, and then there's just like a little mesh basket on one end, and it was a small one. It was one of those really fine strainers that I just had in the kitchen. It was about 4 inches wide and really fine mesh strain. And so I'm sitting there and I'm running the beer through this thing, and I'm like, man, this sucks. It keeps getting filled up with Trub, and there's hop material that's plugging everything. So I keep having to like turn it off and then dump it and then come back and redo it again. And I think at the end of that, I just said, screw it, I'm done. I just ripped it. I let it rip and just dumped everything in there.
Well, and you hear often from not just new brewers, but people who've been around a while who may not have a valve on their kettle, and you know, if they're doing, I don't know, you know, maybe they're doing extract or partial mash or whatever, but they literally just take their entire kettle of wort and dump it into their fermenter, the whole thing, you know, Trub and all, and you know, a lot of them are reporting good results. So I will say this before we move on. The experiments that I've done in the past, the first Kettle Trub experiment, I believe it was a cream ale, and then the second one I believe was a pale ale or something like that. Both of those beers, for the high Trub version, we already said it was clearer. The high Trub beer was cleaner. I noted it as being cleaner, more pleasant overall. I actually preferred, in both of those first initial experiments, I actually preferred the two high Trub beers over the ones made with no Trub. Now, some of the things that I heard in the comments afterwards were that, well, one of the reasons is I don't use yeast nutrient. And so those high Trub beers also were ostensibly high nutrient compared to the ones, the low Trub beers, which didn't have any, external nutrient added to it. And I also don't oxygenate. I rack fiercely, but I don't use oxygen or anything like that. And another one of the comments that I got quite a bit actually was that, when you rack wort over with a decent amount of Trub in it, it kind of reduces the need for oxygenation as well. I don't understand why, but those are some of the arguments. Again, I preferred these high Trub beers, and I was curious to see how a pale lager would turn out when fermented with equal amounts of high Trub as these first two experiments. So I put it to the test. Results when we return. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. It's not terribly often that the results from an experiment cause me to drastically shift my own beliefs and brewing method, but I've got to admit that after the first couple of Kettle Trub experiments that I performed, where I ended up liking those, the versions fermented with a lot of Trub more than the one fermented with basically no Trub, I sort of stopped worrying much about letting the wort settle before filling my fermenter. Now, at the time, most of the beers I was making were more characterful ales, and that I fermented quickly, got them off the Trub within 2 weeks or less. And having adopted a love for lagers, particularly at the time, at least, the cool fermented lagers, which required more time in the firm vessel, I designed an experiment to see how high amounts of Kettle Trub would affect a classically cool fermented Pilsner. So for this one, I brewed up a single 10-gallon batch of German Pilsner that was 91% Mecca grade Pelton malt, which is their Pilsner-style malt, and 9% Venora, which again is their Vienna-style malt.
Hey, there's Venora again.
I know. Venora's coming up all the time. And that is that 91.9 of Pilsner Vienna is my go-to pale lager grist. I use it for a lot of pale lager recipes.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar on that too. So I'm 90-10. I mean, 1 percentage point off, but yeah, usually a 90% pills and then 10% of something else, depending on whatever the lager is. That's pretty much my German lager recipe.
Yeah, well, you clearly have a shitty palate because that 1% extra of Vienna is so noticeable.
Yeah, clearly it's.
I'd be willing to bet that if it was 100% Pilsner malt, we probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But whatever,
right.
We do it to do it. I mashed this at 154 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 68 C, for 60 minutes, and then at the end of the mash, I boiled the wort for 60 minutes. I used all German Perle hops. I wanted to learn more about that fun hop. I did 13 grams at first wort hop, 15 grams at 30 minutes. 30 grams at 5 minutes, and a 30-gram dry hop. This was a Hop Chronicles beer, so I did a little bit of a dry hop halfway through. After the boil, I chilled the wort as quickly as I possibly could to get that cold break, like you mentioned earlier, Cade. And then I took a refractometer reading showing that I hit 1051 OG. Beautiful OG for a German Pilsner. At this point, I placed a block of wood, just a 2x4, under the front of my kettle. It's a 15-gallon kettle. Actually, I think I was brewing in a 20-gallon kettle at this point. I placed a block of wood under the front, raising the end with the valve up about 3 to 4 inches, and then I left it alone for a bit to allow that trub to settle to the back of the kettle. I cleaned everything else up. I think I let it sit for about 20-25 minutes because I really wanted all of that trub to settle out. And then what I did is I filled the first carboy with very, very clear wort. And then once that one was filled to about 5.5 gallons, 5.25 gallons, I believe, I removed the block of wood and I used a spoon to coax out as much of that trub as possible while filling the second carboy.
The pictures of that carboy whenever they're filled, they terrify me.
It's pretty gnarly. And
it's
the
gnarly looking.
Yeah, the fact that the wort was so pale really to me accentuates just how much trub got racked over to that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at the pictures, like the clear beer, it looks great. I mean, it looks like clearly fermented beer. It's you can see through it, you can see the stuff in the background, and then you have the one with the trub, and it looks like you just took your lawn trimmings and dumped them in the carboy with some water.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm hoping the video that I took, I did a time lapse video of how long it took for that trub to settle out in both, so that people got a visualization of just what the difference between these worts was. So you can head over if you just if you search over at brewlosophy.com, search for Kettle Trub. It'll be one of those ones. You can watch that video. It's kind of fun. The carboys then were placed next to each other in my fermentation chamber and allowed to finish chilling to my desired fermentation temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 10 degrees C. Pretty classic temperature for traditional lager fermentation. And it was at this point, once the beers were stable at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that I split a large starter of Imperial Yeast L13 Global, that's the Weihenstephan strain, evenly between both worts. At this point, there were some differences I think that I noted that deserve mentioning. Both worts showed signs of fermentation around the same time, which I thought was interesting because in the past two experiments, the high trub beer started to ferment before the low trub beer, and which I chalked up to the fact that that trub is also bringing over some nutrients and all of that stuff. But in this one, for some reason, both beers started fermenting at around the same time.
Yeah, I found that interesting as well because it seems to me, the results from the first two experiments made sense. You're putting a nutrient into the fermenter. It makes sense that the yeast would be able to get up faster. I mean, none of that really changes. It could just mean that they did that the yeast eventually used the additional nutrients that were in there, depending on what the results of the experiment were. But I found that fascinating as well, especially because of what we expect to see, and also your prior two experiments with something similar. Yeah.
Now, one thing that I did note was that the high trub beer did seem to ferment with more vigor. It was, and by that I just mean the airlock was bubbling more.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so I let the beers sit at 50 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 weeks before I went in and took a hydrometer reading, which actually did show that the low trub beer was lagging behind the high trub beer. After 2 weeks of fermentation, the beer with high trub in it was already down to the predicted or the expected FG of 1012, whereas the low trub beer was sitting at 1019. I thought that was telling at the very least.
Yeah, I find this interesting too. This is a lager strain that you're using on this one. So, to me, it makes sense that the lager strain is going to chew through this at a slower time frame, right? I know we've done some experiments that show that that may not be accurate to think that way, but the point of lagering, letting it sit over weeks, is that you give the lager strain time to chew through everything and create this like nice clean beer. Mm-hmm. And so I found that's fascinating because here you've got two ale strains that chewed through quickly. The one with additional trub fermented fast. We switched to a lager strain, and now we're seeing some definite lag in fermentation. And is that due to the load of trub or whatever else it could be?
Yeah, or at the very least, in the low trub beer, maybe just a lack of nutrient and oxygen. Because I didn't add nutrients, I didn't oxygenate. So interesting, exactly. Nonetheless. I let the beer sit for another week. and went back and checked the FG again, and the low Trub beer hadn't really changed much. So at this point, we're at 3 weeks now. I raised the temperature in the chamber to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 16 C, and I let it sit for another week. So I believe we're at about a month now in the fermentation vessel. And after that week, both beers were at the same a specific gravity of 10-12. So again, notable. The fact that the low Trub beer had finished fermenting basically was probably done before 2 weeks, but that's when I took the first hydro measurement, and just stayed there for 3 weeks and set on a Trub cake for the rest of the time that they were in the chamber. So, all right. So then once they were done, I proceeded with kegging the beers. I did this warm because I didn't want any oxygen to get sucked into the carboys. And I noticed that the Trub cake on the high Trub batch was nearly double the size. So we're talking that compacted, it had time to really compact itself at the bottom of the carboy. It was more than double the size of the low Trub batch.
Yeah. And this one's also really interesting to me too, that you didn't cold crash because one, the Trub cake was so much bigger just from the stuff that settled out naturally.
Right.
But it also sort of stood to reason to me too, like, okay, we're testing Trub. Let's see if any of that lasts into the final beer, into what's actually kegged. So how much of those materials, those fatty acids or the hop acids or hop oils or proteins or any of that stuff is left in suspension and actually makes it into the beer.
Yeah.
I liked that this was a part of that process.
Absolutely. Yeah. That was all that went into thinking for this experiment. So because of what we had observed in prior experiments on Kettle Trub, I skipped fining with gelatin because we wanted to see if the Kettle Trub, had an impact on appearance, on clarity. And then I let the beers, when the beers were in the kegs, I put them in my keezer and put them on gas, and I just let them slow carb over 5 weeks. I let the beers lager for 5 weeks before I began collecting data. I feel like, there are people out there who are going to say you need to let them go 5 months, but I'm not that guy. So
hey, I want to drink beer.
Yeah.
I like lagers,
Yeah.
and you're already 2 months in at this point.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So anyways, what did we notice right off the bat when I started pulling these beers from the kegerator? The first thing I noticed was, surprise, surprise, that the high Trub beer was noticeably clearer than the low Trub beer. Yet again, this is a consistent finding at this point, to the point that I'm convinced that at the very least, one thing you can expect by racking some Kettle Trub over to the fermentation vessel is a clearer beer.
Which is just mind-boggling to me, right? Let's put more stuff in the beer, and it'll come out clearer at the end.
It's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Gosh. So that was one of the first findings, but of course, that doesn't address whether or not there was an impact on, flavor and aroma and all that other stuff. Now, I'll be honest, my expectation, given what I had experienced before, was that the high Trub beer was going to be cleaner, crisper, all of the stuff that I experienced in the prior batches I'd made for the experiments. So, I'm expecting to go into this not being able to tell them apart, or at the very least, being able to tell them apart occasionally and preferring the high Trub beer. I got 7 out of 7 attempts correct in my own personal triangle test. It was very easy.
Pretty good.
It's pretty good, and I'm kind of a shitty taster, but I'll tell you what, 7 out of 7 correct. And surprisingly to me, the high Trub beer was easily the least preferred. Not to say that it was bad, but it certainly had this character to it that I don't know how to describe. I think in the article I used the word flubber. It's like what I imagine flubber, whatever, that stuff Robin Williams made in that movie.
It's inaccurate because I'm thinking now of like gack and things like that.
Exactly.
That I ate whenever I was growing up.
Yeah,
like,
silly putty, like the smell of silly putty. It was kind of that, which is so
I put that
weird.
stuff in my mouth too. I shouldn't have, but I did. We all did.
You weren't a kid if you didn't eat silly putty, right?
Yeah.
Or paint chips. But I strongly preferred the batch that was made with low Trub. Not to say that I wouldn't have liked it more if a little bit of Trub was transferred over, but to me personally, the high Trub beer, for the first time in a series of 3 experiments, for the first time, I really did not like the high Trub beer as much as I did the low Trub beer. But what did blind tasters think? I served the triangle test to 20 participants who had no idea what the variable was. Out of those 20, we would need 11 to identify the odd beer out in order for us to say that this was significant. And in the end, 13 did. So 65% of tasters were able to identify the unique sample in the triangle test, which says that this was a significant experiment. Make of that what you will. But at the very least, we can say that a good portion of our tasters were able to identify the odd beer out fairly reliably, which to me is very interesting. For the first time, one of these Kettle Trub experiments came back significant. What I was curious about was and I don't really like the whole preference question that much, but I was pretty curious about what people would think. And in the end, my opinion was sort of confirmed by the blind tasters. 7 of the 13 preferred the low Trub beer, and only 2 said that they liked the high Trub beer more.
Yeah, this one was fascinating to me. I'm like you. I don't normally pay attention to the preference data because I feel like everybody's preference is totally subjective. I mean, I like beers that other people don't. So to me, we're asking this question because we want to know what the tasters actually tasted. Did they taste something that they preferred in one beer or the other? And this was pretty significant. I mean, you had 7 people reporting that they preferred the lower Kettle Trub beer. That's a huge difference. 7 out of 11 people.
That's more than half of the people saying they like. Now 3 of the people said they didn't have a preference despite tasting a difference, and one person just reported they didn't really perceive a difference, so they were a good guesser. And you have to still include that. That's how stats works.
Yes.
But yeah, pretty interesting findings, anyways. And at this point, I'm thinking, well, what are the implications? Kind of in my mind, we sometimes test the extremes, and so we have to speak to that. And so in my mind, given what I experienced with past experiments on Kettle Trub, I kind of came to a couple quasi conclusions, if you will, for my own personal brewing. You don't, again, make of this what you will. But to me, arguably unrealistically high levels of Kettle Trub appear to have a perceptible impact on more delicately flavored pale lagers when allowed to the beer is allowed to sit on that Trub, for a month. I don't know if we can say much more than that because of the way that we designed this experiment, but that's one of the bigger takeaways for me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think that this experiment was designed really well to address those issues. Right? Is there something in a subtle lager that you can actually taste a difference on? And does aging affect anything?
Yeah.
And, the science behind it supports that maybe the aging actually does cause a difference. And so, your talk about flubber and that kind of taste, maybe that's the way that you perceive the oleic acid or the unsaturated fatty acids that have oxidized in the beer.
Right. Yeah. It's, and I can't help but wonder if maybe if there's like a tipping point where, a certain amount of Kettle Trub intentionally being racked over to the fermentation vessel is actually a good thing, and that is from my prior 2 experiments. That has been kind of my takeaway from that, is that it's actually not a bad thing. You can actually encourage clearer beer with a crisper flavor and less off flavors or whatever by doing that. Maybe you can use a little bit of Kettle Trub to replace the need for nutrients and oxygen. Maybe that is a possibility, but it would seem that intentionally racking crazy amounts may not be, the best bet at this point.
Yeah, I mean, putting all that stuff in the beer. I mean, again, I keep going back to that, putting all of these extra things in the beer, letting it sit for an extended amount of time, and based on the science that we know, that it could expose to oxidation and staling, or at least what some people have found. I don't want to say that science in general has found this, but at least what some studies have found.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But the fact that it becomes clearer, and that there's at least the 2 experiments that you've done that have showed that people preferred the Trub in the beer, giving nutrients, it certainly seems to me like there's some balance that we can come to, right? Certain amount of time, amount of Trub that creates a good beer.
Yeah, it almost, I'm kind of wont to not worry about letting the wort settle after I chill the wort. And what I've learned in doing that is that you are still leaving behind a good majority of the Trub. Once if I chill the wort and then I walk away and I clean something up for 35, 40 seconds, and then I start racking the wort over to my fermentation vessel, all of the biggest chunks of that Trub have already fallen out. They've precipitated out and are sitting at the bottom of the kettle. And then I start racking that wort over to my fermentation vessel. Yeah, it's not super clear, but I have not had an issue. I've not perceived that flubbery flavor in even pale lagers that I've made using that technique. And I've kind of convinced myself that that's actually benefiting the beer that I make. Now, again, maybe it's not, but my experience with my beers has been positive enough that I'm not worrying about it anymore. So that's where I'm at. Are you filtering out Trub still using your small little sieve?
Yeah, no, definitely not. Toss that thing and never did that again.
Yeah, pain in the ass.
Yeah, no, I do something essentially exactly like you do. I don't really whirlpool anymore. I use an immersion chiller, and it's really difficult for me with a spoon to have the immersion chiller chill it down and get some sort of whirlpool going while also trying to chill the wort as fast as I can.
Right.
I think that's more important to me. The chilling the wort down quickly and getting it over into my fermenter so that it's no longer exposed to anything bad that could contaminate the beer. That's what I sort of put as my priority.
Yeah.
And it's been my experience totally. I brew a bunch of lagers. I probably more lagers than I brew ales at this point.
Yeah.
But I don't pay much attention to how much Trub goes into the fermentation vessel. There's inevitably some that goes in there just because of the way that my kettle does. I don't tilt it anymore. I just rack directly, and whatever goes in goes in.
Yeah. I'm sitting here looking at, I have a little bookshelf in the studio here, and I'm looking at New Brewing Lager Beer by Greg Noonan. And I believe it was from that book that it could have been somebody else, but I'm almost certain it was from New Brewing Lager Beer that Noonan recommends, racking the wort from the kettle to a vessel, allowing that to sit, and then racking the clearest wort for like a day, and then racking that clearest wort over to your fermentation vessel, oxygenating, adding your nutrients, pitching the yeast, and fermenting cool. I'm definitely not doing that, and I'm not worrying too much about, like you said, Kettle Trub. So if you're happy with your beer, keep doing what you're doing. But we've got a couple of reader comments I want to get to. Ben Morgan says, very interesting. I was hoping they might taste the same so I can ditch my time-consuming process of racking wort off the Trub to the fermenter and then filtering the residual egg drop soup through a muslin-lined funnel to recover an extra 3 to 4 pints of clear wort. Alas, I think I'll have to continue.
Yeah, Ben. I mean, you're making good beer. So if you're making good beer, doing your process, totally up to you.
Yeah. I'm not a big advice giver. It's funny because, one of the things that drives me nuts about my day job profession as a psychologist is this idea that, therapists are only there to give advice. It's actually the worst thing a therapist can do, in my opinion. But anyways, I'll get off my soapbox on that. I don't
I'm
need
not
to give
touch that one.
Yeah. Just stay away, Mr. Legal guy.
Yeah.
So
all I do is give advice.
That's what lawyers are for.
Exactly.
Well, so I don't mean to give you advice here, Ben. So I'm going to speak about my perspective here. I'm not sure it's worth filtering out the egg drop soup stuff, all of the Trub, to get 3 to 4 pints of extra wort. I'd maybe just up my batch size by 3 to 4 pints so that I can just toss all that other stuff down the drain. That's my opinion. At the same time, I'm not sure I would worry too much about racking a little bit of Trub over to the fermentation vessel. Like we were talking about earlier, it may actually have some sort of beneficial effect.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, it seems like there's some sort of balance of getting nutrients into the fermenter, and Trub being a source of nutrients, getting those into the fermenter, but not putting too much in and letting it sit for too long.
Right. Yep. All right. Bruin Brian says, this may explain the flavor difference in a Bo Pills I brewed a couple months ago that's still on tap. It was a 10-gallon batch split between 2 carboys. I racked them both from my kettle, one with barley, he says barley, but one with barely any Trub, and the other with all the rest. Thinking from your previous experiments, it would make no difference. On the beers, one of the beers seems to be showing signs of oxidation with some sweetness and dark fruit notes, while the other still tastes clean and crisp. They were both treated identically throughout the process, but taste starkly different. Maybe this difference is much more noticeable because the beer isn't hiding behind hops. I've never had this problem with pale or IPA.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It could, it very, very could be. This seems... You say sweetness and dark fruit notes. That's my primary way that I assess oxidation. So sweetness and what I would say is honey-like flavors.
Yes.
So dark fruits is right in there with it. I wonder, obviously I don't know anything about the rest of your process. And you said that they're treated identically, but I don't know if there's some other source of oxygen that may have affected this. I mean, that's what I sort of think at whenever I review this. Now, not trying to critique your process. I mean, I obviously don't know how you did it. It is certainly possible, though, that what you're tasting is that sweetness and that dark fruit note is what Marshall was tasting as flubber.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. We just might experience it differently and not necessarily know, how to explain it perfectly. This one of the things that Brian's story here reminded me of, and I haven't thought about this since I brewed the beers. I have a recipe called Tiny Bottom Pale Ale. It's really good if you're looking for a really simple ale recipe to make to please everybody. Go Google Tiny Bottom Pale Ale.
I brewed Tiny Bottom. It's good.
It's really good. Yeah, I love that beer. I haven't made it in a while. I'm going to soon, hopefully. But it's one of my uncle's favorite beers. My uncle who lives here in town, and he happened upon a kegerator from somebody at one point, and he begged me to make him a batch of Tiny Bottom Pale Ale. And so I figured, well, while I'm at it, I'll just brew up 10 gallons and make a 5-gallon batch for myself, give one to my uncle. I did the same thing. So 10 gallons, I didn't really think about, I wasn't, intentionally coaxing Trub into the fermenter or whatever, but one of the carboys naturally got a little bit more Trub in it than the other one. I noticed it. I didn't think it would be a big deal. Pitched the yeast. I noticed all of the same stuff I've noticed with the previous Kettle Trub experiments. The one with a little bit more Trub took off faster, fermented quicker, was finished to hit FG sooner and all that stuff. Whereas the other one, again, was kind of, lagging behind. And in the end, interestingly, don't tell my uncle this, but I gave him the one I didn't like as much. The low Trub version of this Tiny Bottom Pale Ale was, I wouldn't say it was oxidized. To me, it was just sweeter. And even though it hit the same FG, we've done experiments showing that you can have beers that are 6-7 SG points apart and not be able to tell them apart. There was something about the low Trub version of this Tiny Bottom Pale Ale that was just cloyingly sweet, even though again it hit the same FG. Right, and we're talking right out of the gates. This was not an oxidation thing. It's not like it had been sitting around for a couple of weeks. It just had a different flavor. Whereas the high Trub one was clean. It was everything I expected. Clean, crisp, all of that great stuff. It was clearer. So again, it just seems that there's something in Trub that really does kind of encourage, I guess, like a cleaner, crisper flavor in beer. It's an interesting thing that I can't really speak to very well.
Well, you say that, and that sort of makes me think like an ester of some kind potentially got in there.
Yeah, and maybe I'm
that
perceiving that ester as kind of a sweet,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe that ester was sweet. I mean, I don't know. I mean, isoamyl acetate's a banana ester, obviously, but bananas have a sweetness to them,
Absolutely.
right? So when we taste isoamyl acetate, we increase our perception of sweetness just because that's what we expect when we taste that.
Well, and arguably, if that wort has less nutrients, is not oxygenated, as the a lower Trub wort might be, the yeast is going to have to work a little bit harder to do its job, which ostensibly stresses the yeast out, which could promote the development of some esters or something like that. So I think that's
100%.
Makes sense to me. I'm not sure that's exactly what's happening, but it does make sense to me. Next comment comes from Wilbur, who says, it's interesting that there's such a strong preference for the low Trub beer. That seems uncommon based on past experiments. And he says that that's not limited to Trub experiments. I think what Wilbur's referring to here is that pretty much in the 35 to 40% of experiments we do that are significant, and yes, we do have a lot of significant experiments to the people out there who just love to say we don't. Jesus Christ. On the ones that are significant, where we provide the preference data as well, typically what we see is that there's a split in the preference rating, right? Because preference is subjective. And so we'll see, 5 people preferred beer A and 6 people preferred beer B and whatever. In this one, it was pretty weighted towards the low Trub, which might lead some to think that, I think we can kind of generalize and say that the low Trub beer did, objectively taste better. I'm not sure I would agree with that, but it is interesting. I agree with Wilbur on that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the preference data, again, that's where I look whenever there's a huge disparity in the preference data. And I'm not talking like, 2 or 3 tasters. I'm talking like, 7 of 11 really preferred the low Trub beer. But, it is interesting. That's why we do the preference data, because it's just an additional interesting piece of evidence. I don't know that I would go so far as to say that it's objective, that you could objectively say that the low Trub one, but you could certainly say that in this case, with these beers, the people the tasters preferred the low Trub beer, and that was consistent with Marshall's and with Marshall's experiences too. So.
Yeah. No, I agree. Next, a comment comes from Larry. He says, I wonder how allowing some Trub into primary for a healthy fermentation, but then racking to secondary for dry hop and diacetyl rest would have affected things. That to me, I doubt we would have noticed as big of a difference. Again, this is kind of presumption on my part, but I do think that it was the contact time with that Trub that really affected the beer. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but
no, I mean, I think that makes sense. This is one. I don't know if we necessarily want to do a repeat of this to test that specific issue, because it seems like that may or may not. But the point of this one was contact time with the beer over an extended amount of time.
Yeah.
So it was on there for what we said 4 weeks before, and then whatever was left in suspension for the 4 weeks that it lagered.
Yeah.
So for 2 months total. Maybe it would help. I think there's certainly it seems to me some benefit from having Trub in there, racking in then to a secondary dry hopping and diacetyl resting.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say is I know there was minimal dry hop on this one, but dry hop itself could add to, a potential source of oxidation with
Sure.
Trub still being in there, so you dry hopped on this one, with contact with Trub, so maybe that's also what created it. I have no idea, but maybe.
At this point, all we can do is speculate, but I think it's we're kind of starting to hone in on some interesting stuff here. Final comment comes from Robbie C. This is really interesting stuff. He actually dropped some knowledge on us. He says, cloudy wort can contain anywhere from 5 to 40 times the unsaturated fatty acid content of clear wort. An important fact, because unsaturated fatty acids can have a significant negative effect even at low concentrations. For one, they work against beer foam stability, and they also play an important role in beer staling.
Yeah, I agree, Robbie. This is sort of what we were talking about earlier, although I would make a distinction here in unsaturated fatty acids pre-fermentation. He says cloudy wort, so unsaturated fatty acids pre-fermentation, those are useful and they're nutrients for yeast. Post-fermentation, yeah, absolutely, it's a potential source of oxidation and staling,
right?
And makes sense that if you've got a whole bunch of fatty acids in the beer, that the head stability and the foam stability won't be as high.
Yeah, that was one of the things somebody else asked as well. Was there a difference in foam stability between the beers? And there wasn't, based on my observation. They looked foam looked exactly the same. The beers looked different, but yeah, I appreciate all the comments. That was a good one, Robbie, and I agree that unsaturated fatty acids likely do contribute in the beer, at least, likely do contribute to decreased shelf stability over time. So, well, Cade, that is all the time we've got for this episode. Any last words on Kettle Trub before we get going?
The only thing I'll say is this one, I don't know if this one was the first two experiments that did actually make me less afraid of putting Kettle Trub in your beer. And so I'll say it again for all you homebrewers out there. Do what you want to do with your own process. I mean, I think we've shown that there may be something to adding Trub to the fermenter. There may be something to not adding it for too long. But if you're making good beer, just go do what you do and continue making good beer. Couldn't agree more. And don't forget to head over to brewlosophy.com to read up on the experiment discussed in this episode, as well as all of the other stuff we are up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through no middleman no more.